Okay, hi everyone. This is our lecture on chapter 4, which is the last chapter we're going to cover before our exam. Okay, and so this chapter is focused on stress and the body's adaptation to stress, and then we'll talk about some diseases that have been associated with stress. Okay, but the beginning of the chapter really, we're talking about sort of trying to understand what we mean by stress. And so let's start. Okay, so for the first learning outcome, right, we're just, like I said, we're going to kind of talk about what we mean by stress. We're going to define stress. We're going to talk about coping and adaptation, and then also list some concepts that are related to stress. Okay, so again, just kind of overview here. If we look at some of these terms that I just mentioned in the learning outcome, right, what stress, right? How do we kind of describe stress? And there's obviously, you can't just describe it in a sentence or two, okay? But just kind of in general, just to kind of set, give you a little bit of framework here. So psychologic and physiologic responses to an event. Again, remember, when we're talking about stress, we're going to talk about physiological response, but also psychological response as well. And it says it often applies to perceived threat or challenge, right? So it doesn't actually have to be something, right? Stress can just occur if there is a perception of something threatening, okay? Then we need to talk about coping, right? So these are psychologic and behavioral measures that an individual takes to basically deal with that stress, right? And so they're focused on handling stress demands. And remember, stress demands include both internal and external factors, okay? So there's all of this sort of coping is a big part of how stress is going to affect an individual. And then if we talk about adaptation, again, there are both physiological and psychological processes that occur that allow that individual to adapt, right, in response to stress. If that individual does not adapt, that's when there's an issue, right? So if you look down here, I sort of added this in here because I thought it kind of helps put things in perspective really nicely, right? So adaptation depends on available resources, okay, and the coping strategies that individual is going to implement. If the demands of an event, right, i.e. stress or whatever, demands of the event or whatever that stimuli is, it doesn't necessarily have to be an event. It could be, we're using event in general, right? It could be something internal or external. I guess that's what I'm trying to get at. But if those demands, right, the demands of the event, whatever that is, exceed the individual's coping ability and the resources that are available, then that's when stress occurs, okay? So you always have to talk about all three of these together, okay? Stress isn't just something that happens like a car accident, like your father dying. It's the stress that your body encounters is a result of coping and adaptation to that stimulus, okay? All right, so if you look at some of these concepts, right, related to stress and to coping, you could see there are a lot, right? Again, important as a clinician to understand how many things stress or things that are happening in your patient's life can affect their health, okay? And so again, remember I just said, we can't just really you have to kind of talk about stress and coping sort of together, okay? So if you just look on this end here, if you kind of look at what this is kind of showing you is kind of more things that are more related to an increase in sympathetic activity. So when we think about fight or flight, it's these type of things that are going to happen in a fight or flight response, right? So you have an increase in sensory perception. And so for the most part, all of these are increase, right? Or activation. Hearing improves, vision improves, right? Increased heart rate, increased blood pressure, right? Increased blood clotting. Because again, this is the fight or flight response. So you would want all of these things happening if you're trying to get away from somebody or you're fighting off an intruder or something like that. All of these things are very helpful in that case, okay? But now if you kind of then, bring into play kind of coping, a lot of these other mechanisms are involved here. And these are kind of more related to activation of the HPA axis. And we're going to talk about these two things later on, okay? But you have things like the digestive system slowing. You have glucose that's released into the bloodstream as a result, right? And again, that's good in the short term, but in the long term, some of these things are going to be aren't going to be so good. Again, good in the short term, right? Increase blood flow to muscles. But then if you kind of look at emotional regulation, you can kind of see some things some emotional effects, some cognitive effects here. And then if we look at immunity or immune system, there's definitely complex relationship between sort of stress and the immune system. And I'll talk about that a little bit more as well. But you see suppression of immune function here, increased susceptibility to infection because of the immune function suppression, right? And so that's why kind of you say, oh, if you're stressed out, you may be more likely to get sick. Well, some of that's due to the suppression of immune function, and also is showing you delayed wound healing. However, there are, and you'll see this just so that I'll kind of put this out there right now, there are many studies that have shown that acutely stress may increase or activate the immune system, but sort of more longer term, you see decrease in immune function. And so the point is that the relationship between stress, right, again, as a really broad sort of general term that involves coping and all those, you have to involve that all sort of together. There's a complex relationship really between the immune system and stress and what it's going to evoke. So there have been reports where you have suppression of immune function, but there also have been studies that have shown increase. Again, the sort of increased immune function, you kind of think of more as acute stress versus chronic stress. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But again, point being, right, that you have really a wide variety of systems affected by stress. Okay. All right. So next, learning outcomes. So let's summarize the major conceptual approaches to the study of stress. So again, these are all conceptual approaches in terms of how to understand, right, or conceptualize stress and what it means, okay? So to sort of all of these kind of stress concepts, right, there's sort of this sort of underlying assumption that you're always going to get some sort of sympathetic arousal, right, or increase of the sympathetic or activation of the sympathetic nervous system, okay? So again, that's that fight or flight response, okay? So it's your sort of innate human response to some sort of external threat, okay? It provides that energy, right, to beat somebody up or to run away really fast, okay? However, it's believed that this type of response is maybe not so useful in now, right? So again, if we think about our environment is much more complex than it was, a million years ago. And so the idea is that perhaps maybe sometimes we get this sort of activation of the sympathetic system leading to this fight or flight response when in a lot of situations where maybe it's not necessary. Okay. So that's kind of what this is getting to. It says now demands are subtle and psychologically intricate, right? So it's not just beat somebody up and run away. There's a lot more involved, okay, in sort of that initial response, okay? But regardless, if you talk about a physiological sort of response to a stressor, this is going to happen, right? And remember that this leads to these types of things, this increase in heart rate, this increase in blood pressure, which I'm sure we've all experienced at some point in our life. Okay. Now, if you think about, one second, I need a drink. If you think about this sort of now thinking more of this stressful experience, right? It's not just about, the stimulus of the stressor, right? There's all these other things involved. And I sort of alluded to this already, okay? You have to consider all of these things, right? Coping patterns, lifestyle, overall health, genetics, right? Nutritional state. All of these things need to be considered when you're thinking about stress. So you have to think of it as an experience that involves the individual and their lifestyle, okay? And so again, I sort of added this in here, down here, and to sort of reiterate and make you understand why it's so important to be familiar with these conceptual approaches, right? To understand that all of these things are involved, right? Because then you can understand how any sort of life event that might happen to your patient can really influence health, right? Again, stressing the importance of how a sort of very in-depth patient history is super important, right? Okay, so if we look again, we're still talking about these conceptual models of stress, right? a lot of them will focus, or often they will focus on one aspect of this larger stress process, okay? And the reason why, again, these are conceptual models because you want to focus on one aspect to then get more detail of that, right? Remember, the larger process is what we're talking about on that last slide, is the stressful experience, right? It encompasses all of these things, okay? But in order to really kind of look at some of these aspects in more detail, you have to maybe just consider sort of one of those, okay? So that's what this is saying here. So some of these conceptual models may focus more on the events or the conditions that produce the stress. Also, they'll sort of take the approach as to, is it a social stimulant, right? In terms of the stimulus, right? Social, right? Psychologic or physiologic response. And so again, this is just kind of giving you an idea. We're going to talk about some of these models in a second. So this is setting up for that. Okay, so if we talk about the effects of stressors, right? If we're going to kind of specifically focus on that, okay, they're going to activate, or a stressor, in again, quotation marks, is going to activate central nervous system pathways, right? Or CNS pathways. Examples of these pathways, to which we are going to talk more detail about later on in the lecture, are here. So HPA axis, hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. I'm not going to tell you details now because I'll tell you later, so I don't want to tell you twice. And then I'll have the appropriate slide in front of me. Sympathetic nervous system, I already mentioned this, right? This is, if you see CNS, sympathetic nervous system, this is the fight or flight, okay? The endogenous opioid pathway also is activated in times of stress, and this is going to take a more, this is sort of the inhibitory side of it, right? So if that pathway gets activated, it may serve to suppress HPA and sympathetic nervous system, okay? Now, we're not going to talk specifically really about the endogenous opioid pathway, but know that it plays into this, okay? And it interacts with these two pathways here. All right, like I said, details on those pathways later on, all right? All right, if you think about effects of central nervous system activation, right? You see increased levels of neuroendocrine hormones, right? Like, well, again, we're going to talk about those specific hormones later on, so let me just not say that right now. But an increase in these types of hormones can lead to suppressed immune responses, which again, I sort of mentioned on that first, or that, early slide where we saw all of those concepts related to stress, okay? If you think about chronic stress, right, you're going to, again, have an increase in these hormones that are produced, okay? Things like glucocorticoids here are referring to like cortisol, right? Stress hormone, cortisol. Catecholamines really referring to norepinephrine, epinephrine. And again, we're going to talk about those in more details, okay? Again, leads to immune suppression, okay? So again, the stress and the body's responses to stress are going to ultimately affect the immune system. However, it's not so cut and dry in terms of how, okay? So if you're reading the textbook, they really do provide a lot of examples and some evidence from research in terms of how stress affects the immune system. And if you're reading through it, you may find it, there's a lot there, right? And some things are conflicting, and that's just because it is a very complex relationship between it, okay? But nonetheless, stress, in quotes, will affect immune function, okay? All right. So if we look at some of these, bodily effects of stress, again, you're going to have a lot of different effects, okay? So if you look at stimulating effects of stress, increased blood flow to the brain. We said some of this or we saw some of this on that concept diagram, okay? So again, these are all stimulating effects, okay? If you look at inhibiting effects, rate of digestive system is going to be inhibited. So again, this is primarily kind of thinking about the sympathetic activity. Immune system activity is going to be inhibited, urine production inhibited. Why? If you're fighting off some, intruder or something like that, you probably don't want to have to go pee and run to the bathroom, right? So it makes sense that it's going to inhibit. So think about these in all sort of within the scope of that fight or flight response, and probably all of them will make sense to you, okay? All right, now we're starting to get a little more complicated here, right? So if we look at this figure, again, I sort of alluded to this. If we want to, again, think about sort of on this left-hand side, this is sort of kind of extra information that I'm not necessarily providing you detail about. So like I said, if you read through the textbook, you read other information or other journal articles about this, you can find a lot of information on the interaction between stress and certain immune molecules or immune function, okay? And so again, let's just sort of summarize that as understanding that it is a very complex relationship between stress and immune function, okay? There have been studies that have shown that acute stress can actually increase immune function, which would promote protection from infection, right? If you think about a stressor being like a wound, right? Like some really serious wound that you experience. Well, it would make sense that immune function would be increased to prevent infection in that wound, right? Okay. However, if you think about like the stress being not something like that, like an open wound, maybe it's not so helpful that immune function might be increased and potentially could lead to autoimmune diseases. Now, again, remember, there are lots of studies that show that, oh no, I have a typo here. Lots of studies that show, stress decreases immune function, okay? And so that's what I'm showing you here. And again, if we want to kind of try to make sense of this in our brain, maybe think about an acute stressor, like I gave you the example of like a wound or an injury. Maybe in the short term that might promote immune function, right? But again, kind of more generalized types of stress or more chronic types of stress usually lead to a decrease in immune function. And again, that's why we associate with being stressed with being ill, right? It's probably a lot of that has to do with the decrease in immune function, not everything. Okay. So if you look at this diagram here, a couple things going on here. So what this is showing you here, again, here's your psychosocial stress. You can get an increase in cortisol. Remember that this is the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis or HPA axis being activated. Here's the increase in sympathetic activity, right? This is primarily, these effects are primarily caused by the release of norepinephrine and epinephrine, okay? And so again, you can see here that if we look at the effects of cortisol, you have a decrease in pro-inflammatory cytokines. This is all the immune functions here, right? So this is all have to do with immune functions here, decreasing wound factors, right? Decreased wound strength, decreased wound closure, all will lead to a risk of wound infection and a decrease in healing, okay? So these are all decreasing immune function or inhibiting immune function, okay? But you can also see that sympathetic activity can also sort of lead to a decrease in immune function, which can ultimately lead to an increase in infection and a decrease in wound healing. Okay, so again, remember that this is particularly showing you psychosocial stress, not like the example that I gave you here where it's like you have a open wound. Okay, so important, so there are lots of, again, different types of stimuli. And remember, you then have to consider what's going on inside the individual's body in terms of what responses are going to occur. Okay, so again, I hope I make you appreciate how complex really the relationship between stress and the immune system, but even stress and any physiological process is super complex. Okay, so you can read a little bit more details here where it's giving you some details again about what's happening here. These again are, I don't expect you guys to memorize, that like an increase in cortisol leads to a decrease in neutrophil and monocyte recruitment to the wound. Okay, that's probably a little bit beyond the scope of our class. But if I showed you this, you should be able to explain what's going on here, right? So it's more about never memorizing these figures, but really understanding what they're showing. All right, so moving on from this. Now, if we look here, what this figure is particularly showing you now is, yes, this involves immune system, right? Here, it's showing you an increase in cytokines, okay? So if you looked here, if it's showing you the primary effects of an increase in cortisol, it's showing you a decrease in pro-inflammatory cytokines. Well, in this case, there are other types of responses to stress, okay, that can increase inflammatory cytokines. And then those cytokines can end up crossing the blood-brain barrier and end up in the brain. And then they are believed to mediate these types of behaviors, this sickness behavior, and these types of behaviors that are related to sickness, okay? So really what this is specifically showing you is the mechanisms involved in eliciting sickness behavior, okay? So again, it's not necessarily going against this, right? Because this is primarily illustrating what's happening, you know, how is cortisol affecting the cytokines. This is just showing you, hey, in response to certain types of stressors, right? And this is again showing you sort of infection, injury, inflammation in general, probably due to some sort of, you know, whatever, again, what we can consider a stressor, you can have an increase in cytokines that occurs, again, ends up in the brain and impacts sickness behavior, right? And leads to things like apathy, fatigue, decreased appetite. So where are these types of feelings or behaviors coming from? It's believed to be mediated by these inflammatory cytokines that can get into the brain, okay? So we'll leave it at that. Again, illustrating the sort of complexity of all the things that are going on when one encounters some sort of stressful stimulus. Okay, now next we're going to talk a little bit about two concepts here, homeostasis and allostasis. Okay, now hopefully we've heard the term homeostasis before. If we want to generally sort of define homeostasis, we can say that it's an internal state of balance, right? If you think about like body temperature, right? Your body temperature needs to be maintained at its normal level. If body temperature gets too high, there are mechanisms in place, right? Negative feedback mechanisms to bring it back to its normal temperature. If that body temperature gets too low, again, there are mechanisms that will be initiated to bring it back to normal temperature, okay? So homeostasis can be applied to anything, right? It can be applied to the levels of stress hormones. It could be applied to really any hormone level in the body. It can be applied to blood pressure, right? Really any sort of physiological state. What this implies, right, is that there is a degree of internal stability, okay? Again, it needs to be maintained. Okay, sorry, there was a little tiny pause there. So again, homeostasis implies a degree of internal stability, okay? We need to maintain that degree of internal stability, okay? And there are lots of mechanisms that are involved, okay? Helps that all those mechanisms that are put in place help the body return back to its normative state, okay? There are negative feedback mechanisms, like I mentioned, to bring that body back to its resting point, okay? I gave you these examples essentially already. Again, if you think about any hormonal regulation, this is true specifically for cortisol. Remember, cortisol is your stress hormone, which is released from the adrenal glands. When levels get too high, there are negative feedback mechanisms that are implemented to bring those cortisol levels down, okay? Says here, activation of the sympathetic nervous system by stress, right, causes the body to deviate from its normal physiological resting point. Therefore, mechanisms get activated to bring it back, okay? So that's why we're talking about homeostasis in our stress chapter. All right, sorry, next slide. Now, another term here, allostasis, okay? So instead of considering the body to be, or this sort of innate sense of stability, in allostasis, you're gonna kind of consider that the body is in a continual state of flux, okay? So within the context of daily life, a person is always changing, okay? So it's not really this sort of resting point. There's this sort of normative flux that's going on, okay? So the body's always responding to multiple environmental demands. There's always going to be some physiological mechanisms that are activated, some that are going to be at rest, okay? So it's kind of, I guess this is a sort of more realistic way of thinking about it when we're kind of thinking about the body and its relationship to stress, okay? It says here, the physiological mechanisms that are under investigation are the same as when we're talking about homeostasis, okay? We're primarily still focusing on the sympathetic nervous system and the HPA axis, okay? I think the difference really between allostasis and homeostasis is homeostasis, I guess, is more strict and stringent, saying like, this is the normal resting state. In allostasis, it's just giving you a little more of a range there in terms of its normal state, okay? So again, similar ideas. So again, if we're going to talk about allostasis, right, We can consider physiological parameters, like I just mentioned on the last slide, sympathetic nervous system and HPA axis, right? Activation, alteration of immune function, a whole bunch of physiological processes that are going to be activated by stress, right? They get activated, and then there's going to be mechanisms that come into place to kind of get it back to its sort of normal range. However, there are also behavioral implications of allostasis, or behavioral parameters here, okay? So if you think about emotions or behaviors, right, some of them are experienced along a sort of normative spectrum, okay? So we can kind of consider things like substance use, right? Substance use, substance abuse, right? Dietary influences, exercise, etc. You can think of other behaviors as well. So I guess the idea kind of is, in terms of the spectrum, right, is that you can develop psychopathologic states, right? Even if you think of something that's good for you, right, on kind of different ends of the spectrum. So maybe in order to cope with stress, right, you exercise each day, an hour each day. However, this can become pathological if we're overtraining to the point of being ill or injured, okay? Again, maybe you're having one drink a day versus being dependent on alcohol, okay? And so that's what the idea of the spectrum means here, okay? And again, we're bringing behavioral. So again, it's kind of this idea that you're deviating from this sort of normal range, okay? And that stress can have that effect. Okay, now there's a term called allostatic load, okay? And this is going to happen when the mechanisms involved in responding to that stressful experience, right? State of exhaustion. Okay, sorry. So allostatic load sort of terms or suggests that you kind of end up in this sort of state of exhaustion, right? So all of the mechanisms involved in responding to that stressful experience either fail to cease to function after removal of that stressful event, right? Or they falter in providing a response to that initial event, okay? So I guess this is supposed to be lead to. One second. I again have a typo here. Sorry, that's why I was like, what? Okay. Let's think of it. Let's define it a little bit better that way. So occurs when the mechanisms involved in responding to stress experience, right, lead to a state of exhaustion. So those mechanisms fail to cease to function after removal of the stressful event, or they falter in providing a response to that initial event. And you have to think about kind of it's gonna take into account sort of every stress-related sort of wear and tear, right? Multiple stressful events and things that have happened to your body. It says it compromises more than just the effects of the stress responses, meaning it's going to affect other systems of the body as well. And again, we need to remember that these physiological mechanisms, right, that are maybe sort of failing to respond are also interacting with genetics, nutrition, and all these other aspects of life. Okay, so again, one individual may experience allostatic load, sort of given the same types of experiences, versus another that might not. Again, because it's going to consider all of these things as well. Okay. All right. I may, before I upload this for you guys, I may alter this a little bit just to make it a little more clear. But the way I explained it is what I meant to do, but I think I have to just kind of just alter the words up there. Okay. So for learning outcome 4.4, right? Compare and contrast the various models of stress response. So again, we were kind of setting up for this when we were kind of talking about the different conceptualizations of stress in terms of kind of like what they're going to focus on. Now let's outline some of these models. Again, these are just models in terms of how the body's going to respond, okay? So if we talk about models that focus on stress as a response, okay? Meaning it's focusing on that response. It's not focusing on what the stress is. So there's other models that we'll mention that may focus on stress as a stimulus, right? Or focus on stress as a transaction. Here, the model focuses on stress as a response, okay? So these models will emphasize the biologic or the physiologic responses to stress, okay? Again, the main emphasis is on the response, okay? It says it may consider events that evoke stress, but again, it's mainly focusing on the body's response. All right, so if we focus on the response, one well-known model, right, is this model that was described by Seeley, okay? And it's called the General Adaptation Syndrome, or GAS model, okay? Again, it focuses on the response, okay? So it says here, stress, okay, is a theoretical construct to depict an individual's response to a clearly defined event, okay? So clearly defined event, how does the body respond to that? Okay, so it says here, so again, that's the central focus. The event or demand produces some degree of strain on that individual. And again, it's going to depict that individual's response to that stressor, okay? What's the stressor? It is any event or stimulus that triggers a stress response, right? So that's how you're kind of defining the stressor, because you're focusing on the response. There are three main stages to this: alarm, resistance, and exhaustion, okay? And so if you look at this graph that's depicting these three phases that I just mentioned, or stages, okay? So alarm, resistance, and exhaustion. So if you look at phase one, alarm, right? Shock phase, the body prepares for the cascade of physiological reactions that are going to happen. Body's defenses are triggered here. This is sort of this counter shock phase. But really what we're talking about here in phase one is the sympathetic nervous system activation, that fight or flight response, right? Release of catecholamines, norepinephrine, and epinephrine, okay? If you look at phase two, stage of resistance, this is really now HPA axis activation, or the release of cortisol, okay? The body's going to attempt to move back towards homeostasis or allostasis. However, if you have chronic exposure to stressors, you may then develop sort of resistance to other stressors, okay? Meaning that you're not going to be able to bring it back to homeostasis because you have multiple stressors, right? Now, if the body fails in this phase, it can move to phase three, which is this stage of exhaustion. So the body can't maintain its adaptations to stress, okay? Energy and resources become depleted, and here's where disease may develop. Even death could occur if it's serious enough, okay? And so you can kind of see this is being homeostasis here, or normal state, right? And you can see it's going to sort of increase with this stimulus that occurs, but then ultimately, sort of come back. Again, if it fails to be able to even maintain homeostasis, it can sort of fall off, and then that's where you're going to see disease or even death that could occur. Again, remember that coping and adaptation will interact with these processes to moderate these effects, okay? So that doesn't mean you experience a stressful stimuli and all these things are happening, okay? So again, this is just a model to show what are the responses that could occur, right, to somebody who experiences some sort of stress, right? Some sort of stimulus. Okay. Okay. Now, you can also think about models, or there are also models, right, that people have developed, scientists or clinicians have developed, that really highlight or think about stress as a stimulus, right? That the focus is that, okay? So it says here, these models or approaches really highlight the situation, right? So again, if you want to sort of define stress within these models, right? Environmental threat or danger that elicits a response, okay? So it can be a physical threat, it can be, death of a loved one, it can be anything like that, okay? So if you again kind of consider these stressors here, significant life events, they pose a threat, right? Or they may require some sort of significant life change. So any of these sort of life events that are perceived as being negative, okay? However, there could be positive stressors as well, okay? If you kind of think about how this will influence or impact overall health, you have to sum up all of the, sum total of the nature of the experiences, and in terms of kind of all of these different types of life events that are experienced, and if most of them are negative, right? If you have sort of these then enduring responses to them, it can lead to illness. So again, these are just models in terms of how do we understand or think about stress, right? Okay, so let's a little bit more on these. So again, if you're really focusing on stress as a stimulus, okay, you have to talk about determining the characteristics of events that serve as stressor, right? So a lot to do with perception, right? So perception of whatever that stressor is or that event is leads to some sort of physiologic response. So how that event is interpreted, okay? And again, you still going to get the same sort of physiological responses that we've been talking about, right? So again, it's saying here, sympathetic fight or flight response is viewed as a protective response to these events, right? Then it says unresolved anxiety due to conflict may cause physiologic consequences. So again, if you have this sort of perceived notion or the idea that you have an anxiety over or a fear or this perceived notion that something is a threat, even though it might not be, it can then lead to physiological consequences. So again, it's the idea of this sort of perception of that stimulus. So as long as that stimulus is perceived to be a threat, it will lead to a stress response. Okay. So again, focusing really on that stimulus. Okay. So it has to do with, again, what is that perceived to be, that stimulus? If you now focus on models that focus on stress as a transaction, okay, again, this is saying the most significant factor in the process is, again, the individual's perception or appraisal of the event, okay, perceived meaning of the event. Also, you got to still consider coping resources, right? So these things are all still going to be considered here. Some of these models will outline sort of these phases in terms of appraising that event. So again, these transactional approaches are really focusing on how that person is going to appraise that event and deem it a threat or not. So 2 phases outlined here: primary appraisal, right? So evaluation of the event's impact on well-being, really just focusing on the stimulus, right? What is that stimulus? What does it mean within the scope of the individual's life? The secondary appraisal now is then going to consider, well, how do I deal with this, right? What are my coping resources, coping mechanisms and coping resources that are available? Okay. So again, it's kind of, the idea is that it's considering this as a transaction, meaning that there's a primary appraisal and then a secondary appraisal, and then everything else will kind of go from there. Okay. So, remember, all of what I just went through, these are just models of stress, and each one of them sort of, I guess, emphasizes a different aspect. What's actually happening to a patient when they're stressed are kind of all these things, right? So it's not like, you guys can see how there's a lot of similarities between this. So again, this model here really focuses on the response, right? I think you guys all agree. The other 2 that we talked about were really more focusing on the sort of the stimulus and then really appraising that stimulus and not really necessarily talking about the response. But it's important to talk about all these things because these are all of these, the appraisal of the stimulus, the perceived or the perception of the stimulus all come into play when we're talking about stress's effects on the body. And then obviously the responses are important as well. Okay. Now, if you look at, so this is a figure that's sort of depicting these transactional or the components of this transactional nature of stress. So again, you can read a little bit more about this here. So it says such dispositional aspects, including personality and physical health, right? So again, we said there's some sort of event, right? Some sort of stimulus. It's then appraised by the individual, and personality is going to affect that appraisal. Okay. And then, depending on how it's interpreted, it's going to lead to different responses here. Right. And then obviously you have to, think about coping and how that fits in as well. Okay. And so you could see that, then health is down here sort of at the bottom, right? And it's not necessarily saying negative or positive. It's just showing you how all of these different aspects of kind of stress and that surround it feed into the ultimate sort of end all here being health, right? How is it going to affect health? Okay, it says here, events that are not perceived as life-threatening result in a degree of cognitive dissonance or discomfort, right? And undergo a degree of cognitive interpretation before the development of stress. Okay, so again, the initial stress response depends on coping resources available to the individual. Okay, so, and then obviously that in turn will impact health. All right, so obviously within this, there's a lot of variability here, and I guess you could probably try to you could probably make some of these arrows thicker or thinner, right? There's definitely a lot of, it's not just sort of straightforward in terms of following these arrows, although you can kind of see some of them are going both ways here, right? So you sort of can appraise this. You may think, okay, this might pose a threat, but then you tap into your coping strategies, and maybe that sort of lessens that threat, and then therefore sort of lessens the degree of stress on your body, and maybe that stress response is not that strong, right? However, if you sort of appraise this stimulus as being threatening, you try to tap into the coping resources, and maybe just at that point they're not available, right? Or maybe you've encountered many stresses, and you're, this sort of coping is just not available for whatever, mentally just not available to cope with it at that point in your life. This then is going to be a more, a stronger stress, lead to a stronger stress response, and maybe has a negative impact on health. Okay, so again, if you're looking here and you're going to have a positive interpretation of it, it's not, again, it's going to decrease the severity of that stressful response, I guess. So again, understanding the sort of complicated interplay between all these components. Okay. Now, the next part focuses on the pathogenesis and the clinical manifestations of stress, okay? So you're probably thinking, oh, finally. But again, I think it's important to go through those models because it's not about, and again, it's not like about distinguishing, I guess, between those models. It's really just sort of understanding what those models are introducing, right? Understanding that, you have to consider the responses to stress, but you also have to consider the perception the individual has to stress, right? And how they're going to decide whether something is a threat or not, right? So all of those components that we talked about in all of those models are important when you think about how stress is going to affect your body or your patient's body, right? And how, and that's the reason why we brought all of those up, okay? All right. Now, if we think, now we kind of talk, I guess, more specifically, right? The effects of stress on health. Okay, we just saw in this last diagram here, health at the bottom. Okay, so what do we mean by that? What are some of the effects? Okay, so again, if we talk about the physiological responses to stress, remember the primary mechanisms in terms of a stress response, HPA axis, right? Hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, and also sympathetic response. So this is saying sympathetic adrenal medullary system, okay? We can think about just increase in sympathetic activity. Locus coeruleus is listed here, or LC. So you'll see the book sort of abbreviates it as LCNE. So locus coeruleus, right? Locus coeruleus, LC, norepinephrine, NE system. Okay, so again, this is this increase in norepinephrine and epinephrine that sort of leads to the fight or flight. The locus coeruleus, I'll show you a picture in a second, is just a specific area of the brainstem that becomes activated when sort of stressful stimuli are coming into the central nervous system. And then that's going to project out to a lot of other brain regions and initiate that fight or flight response. Okay, let's think of it that way. Remember, again, just because I wanted to bring this up, because I think I sort of mentioned it at the beginning of the lecture, we're not going to really talk about this in detail. So remember that the endogenous opioid system, what do I mean by endogenous opioid system? These involve, things like endorphins. Okay, those are endogenous opioid peptides. If we think about the receptors, there's a receptor called the mu opioid receptor. Opiates like morphine bind to the mu opioid receptor. Okay, so there's a whole endogenous system that really is inhibitory in general. And that endogenous opioid system interacts with the HPA axis in the sympathetic system and generally would inhibit it. Also, there's something called GABA, which is an inhibitory neurotransmitter that can also inhibit these processes as well. And actually, this sort of you can kind of think of GABA as being connected with the opioid system. Again, we're not going to talk about that. Okay. So nobody needs to like memorize anything like that. But again, the idea that there are other systems or mechanisms that will interact with these systems to generally inhibit. Okay. All right. So if we talk about the HPA axis, right? Again, hypothalamic, pituitary, adrenal axis, it affects hormone secretion, particularly when we're talking about stress. We're talking about cortisol. Okay. Also involve the pituitary and the adrenal glands. I'm going to show you a picture in a second that outlines it. Like I just mentioned, involved in cortisol release from the adrenal cortex. And there is a negative feedback, especially with cortisol, okay, in which if there is a lot of cortisol released, production of cortisol or high levels of cortisol will feed back and turn off its own production. That's what we mean by negative feedback. Okay. If you talk about this LC norepinephrine system, again, this is kind of what's going to initiate that fight or flight, that increase in sympathetic activity. I told you, this is just a specific region or a group of neurons that is located in the pons in the brainstem, okay? And then it has multiple connections with other parts of the brain, okay? So I'm mentioning here limbic system, which is like amygdala and hippocampus. Particularly if you think about the limbic system, you think about emotional memory, you think about things like fear, okay? Hypothalamus, which is really going to control the endocrine system, thalamus, and portions of the spinal cord. So there are a lot of connections in which then it'll activate those to basically lead to that fight or flight response, okay? So again, primarily it's going to regulate norepinephrine, right? Remember we abbreviated that NE release from the adrenal medulla, but also from central nervous system areas as well, okay? Again, controls alertness, arousal, vigilance. This is that fight or flight, right? This increase in activity. All right. All right, so again, we're going to kind of focus on this. I'm going to show you a picture here. So this is saying, so symptoms involved in the adaptive stress response. Again, we said HPA axis. So this is not the, I mean, I guess we could just kind of think of this all together. We already said this. It's sort of a little redundant, but I guess what I'm doing here is bringing in these brain structures just to show you, okay? So HPA axis says dopaminergic. We haven't really talked about dopamine. We're not really going to talk about it here. We will later on in the semester. Noradrenergic, that's norepinephrine. So if you see adrenaline or epinephrine, those are the same thing, just two different terms. So NE is the same thing as noradrenergic systems. Okay, and then these are some of these specific brain structures that are involved. So if you think about kind of a stressful stimulus coming in, right? The central nervous system is what's going to detect stimuli, including stressful stimuli, okay? Let's think of that information. It's going to come in through multiple inputs, but ultimately end up here, right? In the brainstem. That's where we said the locus coeruleus was. So it's in the pons here, okay? Then that will send information to various brain structures, and some of them are listed here, okay? So you can see what the sort of role of these are. So it just says pons influences sleep. It does a whole bunch of other things, okay? But yes, it does influence sleep, okay? So if we kind of think about the amygdala, like I told you, emotion, fear, anxiety, amygdala. Hypothalamus, right? Release of hormonal mediators, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. Thalamus is really a relay station where it's going to sort of relay and process sensory information and send it up to the cortex here. So if we look particularly at the frontal cortex, right, things like personality, right, response interpretation. Remember we were talking about the subject's perception of a stressful stimuli, okay? Some of this is some of this is gonna happen here in the frontal cortex or the prefrontal cortex, okay? And then again, there's going to be other signals that are sent to other brain areas as well. So this is a gross oversimplification of what's happening, okay? But let's kind of have an idea here of some of these major brain regions that are involved. So like if I ask you about amygdala, we should know that primary kind of role of amygdala is regulating emotion, particularly fearful emotions, and also involved in anxiety, okay? All right. Now, if we so again, this is really illustrating the LC/NE system, right? The locus coeruleus norepinephrine system. So the idea is that the LC, which is in here, will become activated, and it will send signals and activate a whole bunch of other brain areas, some of them of which are listed here. That then will ultimately lead to this increase in norepinephrine and epinephrine actually systemically as well, okay? And that will lead to that fight or flight type of response. All right. Now, if you now look at hypothalamus here, right, we talked about the HPA axis, okay? So again, stimuli is going to come into the central nervous system, activate these brain regions that we mentioned here, then norepinephrine, epinephrine will ultimately be released as a result. Also, what's going to happen is this HPA axis is going to be activated, okay? So what this is again showing you is this sort of CNS. So wait, let me go back here. I mean, I guess we can let's think of it this way, as any stressful experience, something that the individual is going to experience as a stress or a threat is going to activate these brain areas, okay? Primarily, again, we said this sort of initial inducer is sort of LC that exists here, okay? But again, if we're thinking about perception or receiving of stimuli, right? It's the nervous system that receives all stimuli, whether they're just a basic sensory stimuli or a more complex emotional stimuli or what have you, okay? The stimuli is coming in. There are lots of brain regions that will become activated to assess that stimulus, okay? And again, here we're talking as stress as the stimulus, okay? Then once these brain areas are activated, they're going to then activate, this sympathetic activity, the fight or flight, and also activate the HPA axis. So on the next slide, you can see that, right? Here's your stimuli coming into the central nervous system, right? Lots of brain regions that are activated that then will project information to other, or those brain areas that become activated will then activate these sort of two main mechanisms in response to stress. Okay? So I'm trying to it's hard, there's a lot of detail and it's complex, right? So I want you guys to have an overview. I also don't want to confuse you, okay? So again, remember, what's shown here is an oversimplification. There are many other brain regions that sort of feed into this, that are involved. And in fact, you can actually show like arrows in terms of what's influencing what, but we're not even going there, okay? We should be familiar with this. So I always say, you don't need to really memorize these things, but we really need to know when we talk about HPA axis, that means after there is some sort of stimuli that the individual deems as a stress, right? These pathways are going to be activated by the central nervous system. So what's going to start here is information is going to get to the hypothalamus eventually. Hypothalamus is going to release corticotropin releasing hormone, CRH, okay? That CRH will go directly to the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland basically hangs right on, does it show it here? Doesn't really. That's kind of, actually, it's not even showing you. Where it's showing you amygdala is not really correct. But anyway, I'm not even going to go there. The pituitary gland basically hangs right off of the hypothalamus, okay? So the CRH released from the hypothalamus goes directly to the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland then releases something called adrenocorticotropic hormone, or ACTH. That ACTH goes into the general circulation. Ultimately, its target is the adrenal cortex, the outside of the adrenal glands, in which then cortisol is released, okay? If we talk about the fight or flight, right, or this norepinephrine kind of system, right, LC norepinephrine, that's what this stands for. Once again, these central nervous system areas are activated, it essentially is going to lead to release of norepinephrine and epinephrine from the adrenal medulla. So ultimately, again, central nervous system areas become activated, but ultimately they're then going to activate the adrenal gland. Okay, so this is again specifically the adrenal medulla. So norepinephrine and epinephrine are hormones that are released from the adrenal medulla. Norepinephrine and epinephrine are also present in the brain as well, okay? Okay, so norepinephrine and epinephrine are released from the adrenal medulla. Cortisol is released from the adrenal cortex. All of these things are going to have effects on specific target organs, okay? And then you're going to see these various effects that I sort of showed you before. All right. So wait, let me just go back to what I'm talking about, because I think it's kind of necessary to do that. So let me just go back real quick. So this was kind of like when we went all the way back in the beginning. And we're going to see, I'm actually going to have, right? So some of these things. Okay, so again, when it's showing you the target organs, well, the effects of those hormones on different target organs are going to have effects like this. I'm also going to show you another picture here in a few slides. So let me get to that. Sorry. I just wanted to kind of connect, right? All right, so again, we're showing here target organs. Well, there's various, okay? And so cortisol will have various target organs, norepinephrine, and each one of them will have different effects on those target organs, depending on which one it is. Okay, so it says here, affects every body system, right? Contributes to multiple health-related conditions. Well, I'm sure we're all aware of this. It can also lead to unhealthy lifestyle choices like smoking, substance use and abuse, nutritional changes, risk-taking. Why? Because obviously central nervous system is affected by stress, right? So if you look at some of these effects here and see how variable they are, right? It can affect the hair loss, right? Brain, increased blood flow to the brain, increased release of certain hormones. Also, increased release of certain neurotransmitters in the central nervous system that can lead to some of these psychiatric pathologies or these sort of stress-related diseases like anxiety, okay? Mouth, heart, lungs, muscles, and GI tract. So you can see there's lots of effects here. So we should be familiar with these clinical manifestations, okay? All right, so if you look here, this is again showing you now some disorders and conditions that can be caused or aggravated by stress. Oh, that's interesting. I think that typo is not me, but I'll fix that. That's definitely not how you spell stress, right? Right? So, and we're going to talk about some of these, but the idea again is that there are many disorders. So as a result of cortisol and norepinephrine, affecting these various target organs, it can lead to disease, right? Or pathology. Why? Think about it kind of long-term, right? If you're going to have all these sort of this long-term, effects of both norepinephrine, epinephrine, and cortisol in these target organs can lead to these diseases that are presented here, okay? So if we think about nervous system, anxiety, depression, headaches, insomnia, irritability, personality changes, right? Again, we talked about the immune-related effects of stress. Stress has been shown to exacerbate asthma. I think I mentioned that in a subsequent slide, but we don't really talk about it in detail. Skin, you can see skin effects of stress, right? Musculoskeletal, okay? Just like normal, just like lower back pain, okay? Hair loss, right? Perfusion, if we're talking about, it says congestive heart failure, hypertension, high blood pressure, but even, and then those can all lead to heart attack, right? Metabolism and digestion. You can have both constipation or diarrhea, right? Or both, again, can be sort of exasperated or related to stress, okay? Also reproductive disorders as well, okay? Obviously, we can't talk about everything, every single one of these. We're going to talk a little bit more about some of these, but I think, again, as a clinician, important to understand that stress can affect all of these things. So sometimes, a patient might be coming in with, say, GI symptoms, and you may then do some screening for some, GI disorders or whatever, but for a lot of times, it's just really due to stress, right? It's aggravated or caused by stress. And maybe if they're removed from the stressful situation or they come up with better ways of coping with the situation, some of these things will go away, okay? All right, so again, let's talk about some of these, first, some of the psychiatric disorders sort of specifically, okay? So depression, anxiety, and PTSD, although I don't know that, I don't know that we talk about it in great detail, but a little bit more. So here, it says here, potential emotional responses to a perceived threat, right? Intense fear, helplessness, horror, Okay. Again, perceived threat doesn't necessarily actually have to be a real threat. Okay. These are all influenced by perception. Okay. So individualized perceived meaning of the event, and then what response is evoked by that event. Okay. So it says here, negative affective states that are considered to be responses to stress, right? The most commonly occurring disorders, depression and anxiety. There are others as well. So if we specifically think about anxiety, right, it says there's an external, if you think about it within the scope of a traumatic event, right, an external stressor produces a state of anxiety. That threat is perceived as overwhelming. The individual is unable to cope. It then can lead to anxiety. Now, short-term anxiety, right, it is okay. You have anxiety about an exam. You have anxiety about, I don't know, a doctor's appointment or something like that. That's okay, right? After that threat, sort of goes away, you probably go back to sort of normal state. But when we talk about anxiety disorder, it's sort of this ongoing kind of perception of a threat, right? This ongoing fearfulness that starts to interfere with life, right? It's the idea that you're no longer able to cope with these threats. Okay. Again, sometimes at that point, there may not actually be any stimuli or external stimuli that's evoking that response. It's the response is sort of continuing, right? This sort of perception of a threat continues even when there isn't one, okay? So it says here, if you think about some of the signs and symptoms of anxiety, a lot of them are due to sympathetic activation, okay? And again, in a subsequent chapter, we'll talk more about anxiety and depression. And so that's why we're not getting into really a lot of details about symptoms here, okay? Because really this is focusing on stress, and we just want to kind of talk about the relatedness of stress to anxiety at this point. And then now we're going to talk a little bit about depression here, okay? So there have been many studies that have shown a relationship between stress and depression, right? Many studies that have shown relationship between anxiety, and stress, okay? But they're not all clear cut. Just like we talked about the effects of stress on immune function, not exactly clear cut. There are many different effects that can happen. Okay. One of the things it says here also, it's reciprocal in nature. The idea that depression may influence event perception. So meaning there's sort of already depression there, something happens that may influence how the patient perceives that event. But it also, you can also think of it as sort of being a result, right, of sort of failed coping. So an event happens, not able to cope, that leads to depression, right? Because if you're not able to cope, it leads to things like helplessness, maybe a sense of worthlessness, that all then contributes to depression, okay? So you can kind of see how it can be reciprocal in nature. All right. Hopefully I didn't mess that up. Okay, so again, this is saying psychiatric disorders characterized by continual re-experience of the traumatic situation. That's what this table is showing you, and this is pulled from the DSM-5, right? So the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. Okay, so two disorders that are mentioned here: post-traumatic stress disorder and acute stress disorder. So these are disorders with stress in their name, okay? And in these types of disorder, these are some of the defining criteria, okay? Re-experiencing of a traumatic event through flashbacks or dreams, right? Persistent attempts to avoid stimuli that are perceived to be associated with that traumatic event, even though they may not be, right? And so that's what this then starts to interfere with daily life. Okay. Persistent symptoms of increased arousal. Again, this is due to that sort of perpetual state of increased sympathetic activity. Okay. And then this is just talking a little bit about symptom onset here. If you talk about acute stress disorder, this is kind of these symptoms are occurring within 1 month of that traumatic event, and then they don't really last that long. With PTSD, they develop much later. Okay. So there's some sort of kind of pathologic process that's occurring that's maybe slower, and it leads to a longer, so it takes longer to sort of for the symptoms to occur, but it also then lasts, a lot of times will last lifelong, right? Will last a really long time. Okay. One thing to talk about here and to mention is memory. So it says here, an individual's emotional response to a stressor, right, can have effects on memory. Okay, so let's kind of think about this, and it just brings in kind of the if we're thinking about kind of perceptions and things like that. So it says here, information, and again, this is overgeneralized a little bit, but impossible for us to get into all the nitty-gritty neurological mechanisms here. So information from the senses is organized, right, with sort of perceptual maps, and then sent to higher cortical brain areas. So again, think about like information, stimuli coming into that central nervous system. Okay, it gets processed, it gets organized, and kind of paired up with perception, right? This is all sort of happening in higher cortical areas. Okay, and then interpretation and meaning is attached to that event. Okay, and then your brain areas have to consolidate that information, and that consolidation then makes that memory permanent. Okay, then more processing sort of happens. So if you're going to associate now sort of another stimulus, so say this memory was already sort of permanent in place, something that happened before. Now another stimulus comes in. Okay, it's sort of the job of the hippocampus to sort of pair that new incoming stimulus with something that existed before and sort of add the emotion into it. Okay, so what sometimes happens is that hippocampus isn't able to distinguish sort of threat levels of similar cues. So meaning something that seems similar, say it sort of seems similar. The hippocampus can tie that sort of emotion to another memory that's there, even though it really shouldn't be. Okay, so it's like the idea where I don't even know if the book gives this example, but the idea of, I don't know, there's a child that goes into a neighbor's yard, and gets attacked by a dog, right? And so this is the series sort of thoughtful that memory is made, right? And then now if he approaches another yard or something that kind of looks similar, it's that tie of that emotion that was felt before to this other sort of stimulus, when indeed there is no dog there, right? And so it shouldn't necessarily be tied together. Okay, so anyway, that's going to then be considered a threat. Okay, so that's what it's saying. Unconscious misinterpretation of stimuli may occur. Okay, this sort of idea that something is going to be considered threatful when it shouldn't. Okay, and so what will happen is you have this sort of pathologic stress response, right? It's going to induce the fight or flight. It's going to then lead to increase in cortisol due to activation of the HPA, when indeed there's really nothing that's actually a threat there. Okay, and so it's believed that, and if you think about post-traumatic stress disorder, this is the type of things that happen, right? So you get re-experiencing of the original trauma. So anything that might remind you of that original thing that happened to you, that memory that you have. And let's give another example that's more related to PTSD. So a soldier at war, right, gets injured maybe by an explosive device, right? That sound, so that sound is kind of in its memory in terms of when he was injured. Well, now maybe 10 years later, any loud noise might bring back those memories, right? So that's the idea, that it's tying that stimulus with something it shouldn't be tied with. Okay, and so that's why you have this constant re-experiencing of that original trauma that's triggered by anything that for some reason is associated with it. And so some of the treatments for PTSD, right, cognitive sort of behavioral therapies, try to extinguish that association, right? You don't want that association anymore. So now you got to say, all right, we want to extinguish this idea that loud noise is associated with the bomb, that caused me to lose my leg. Okay, so again, I gave you a little more information than needed, but I guess I wanted you to understand kind of where this is coming from. Again, we're not memorizing any of this, but it's meant to kind of, it's for you guys to really understand why pathologies like anxiety and post-traumatic stress disorder occur, right? What are some of the brain mechanisms that are sort of involved, okay? or psychological mechanisms, but it's really biological as well, right? They all sort of play together. So again, it's saying here, you're always, whenever you experience something that reminds you of that event, you're gonna have activation of the stress response, both sympathetic and HPA, okay? And so it says HPA axis has a role in PTSD, both sympathetic and HPA axis activation, okay? All right. So a few physiologic disorders, okay? So what we just mentioned before, these are more psychological disorders. We mentioned anxiety and depression, okay? Like I told you, in a later chapter, we talk more about these, okay? So it wasn't about getting all of the details in terms of symptoms of these diseases. It's meant to explain the association between stress and these diseases. We often think of depression and anxiety as being stress-related disorders. Obviously, post-traumatic stress disorder, a stress-related disorder. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about physiological disorders or physiologic disorders here, okay? So there are a couple here, so I'll mention these in subsequent slides. These I don't really mention specifically, so just to give you some examples. So respiratory, right? Body systems that might be affected by stress. Again, pretty much any body system, okay? We saw that picture where pretty much everything's affected. Some examples though, if you talk about respiratory, activation of sympathetic nervous system, right? Release of norepinephrine and epinephrine leads just in general to increased respiratory rates, increased heart rate, okay? There's been evidence that stress can worsen asthma due to increased inflammation, okay? And then the increase in respiratory rate can sort of exacerbate that, all right? So just an example there. Like I said, I'll talk a little bit more about neurologic, GI, and cardiovascular. For immune, remember, I set this up in the beginning. There is a really complex relationship between the immune system and stress, okay? But stress one of the things that I didn't, I guess, mention specifically, and I just wanted to bring this up, is that stress can affect the body's response to microorganisms, particularly, right, bacteria, and particularly viruses, right? I'm sure you've heard of the idea of this sort of reactivation of latent viruses, right? Where things like herpes or Epstein-Barr, meaning that the virus sort of remains in your body, but it remains in this latent or sort of non-active state. But stress can sort of reactivate that. Okay, so again, something to kind of to think about there. The book spends a lot of times talking about the effects of stress on the immune response to microorganisms. Okay, so you can read a little bit more if you want on page 91 and basically page 91 and 92. All right, but I'm not going to get into any more detail than that. We've already talked enough. Okay, if we talk about neurologic, and I also wrote immune here because if we're going to talk about multiple sclerosis, it's an autoimmune disorder. Again, we're not focusing on MS and the clinical features of MS and all that. That's for a later chapter. We're relating stress to diseases like this. Okay, so what is MS? Right, autoimmune disorder where the body destroys the cells that produce myelin. Okay, remember the myelin sheath is what covers axons. Okay, and allows neurons to send signals long distances. And so these cells are called oligodendrocytes. And so without enough myelin, right, or if some of that myelin gets destroyed, neurons aren't able to send signals efficiently. Okay, and so that leads to motor deficits, visual issues, and there are others as well. Again, I don't want you guys really to think about the symptoms of multiple sclerosis, but we want to think about the idea of relating stress with it. And what's some evidence to support this, right? So it says anecdotal reports by individuals with MS, but there is also literature that supports this as well, is that psychological stress will precipitate exacerbations of MS, okay? What have you. There's also a theory of the development of MS and that it has to do with inappropriate stress responses. So that you have a dysregulation of cytokines being produced, and therefore that leads to an impaired inflammatory response, impaired antibody production, therefore leading to this autoimmune component that leads to MS. Okay, so that's what this is saying, this sort of alteration in cytokines. Remember, cytokines are they're actual molecules that are released by immune system cells, okay? But then they have various or a lot of different targets that they can then influence, okay? All right. If you talk about GI disease, okay, and you really think about the increase in sympathetic activity, that can promote inflammatory bowel disease. So again, increased catecholamine release, if we're thinking about norepinephrine and epinephrine, can lead to increased motor activity of the colon. If you think about then a blunted HPA response, you can have a lot more of these inflammatory mediators. So I have to just say, these last two slides sort of go along with the idea that stress maybe increases immune activity, right? So this is kind of, if we're thinking about stress related to inflammation, or we're thinking about immune activity and inflammation, okay? So again, that's why I told you it's very complex, okay? Again, it's the idea, again, of this sort of ongoing sympathetic response, this ongoing activation, okay? So also can lead to hypersecretion of gastric acid, so that might lead to acid reflux, okay? So there are a lot of sort of GI effects of stress as well that have been reported. Cardiovascular disease, so both, psychosocial mental stress has been linked to heart attacks, right? Also, there's been evidence that it just puts you at an increased risk for heart attack, okay? There's also been evidence that increased levels of hostility and anxiety will lead to coronary artery disease, okay? So there is a linkage there between stress and cardiovascular disease on kind of a couple different levels. Other studies, or there's been studies that have showed that sort of personality that's characterized by negative affect, right? This sort of negative personality has been linked to poor cardiovascular outcomes, okay? So it's saying personality type may represent a form of chronic stress, right? So the idea of like you're mad all the time, that just kind of puts your body in this sort of chronic stress state, okay? So again, if you're in a chronic stress state, sympathetic activities increase, HPA axis is sort of on all the time, okay? Can lead to chronic inflammation. Inflammation promotes atherosclerosis, right? I think I kind of told you this before, right? If you have, lipids that might adhere to the walls of the blood vessels, what happens when you get a blockage isn't really only just about those lipids there, or the actual kind of, we think of a clot. It's really more about the inflammation that exists as a result, okay? So if you have an increase in inflammation in general, you're going to be at an increased risk of having cardiovascular disease. And stress may lead to increased inflammation, okay? So again, most of these physiological diseases that we just talked about have to do with increased inflammation, okay? All right, so that ends on, I know it's long, okay? And again, I hope you appreciate the complexity of stress and its effects on the body, okay? So in our next class, or at some point, we will do a review. We'll go over those review questions for chapter 4 and also the case studies. If you want to look at those case studies ahead of time, you can. One will be assigned to you. I believe there are 2 in the chapter. One that focuses on kind of psychological effects of stress, and one that's more on the physiological side. All right, thanks, guys.